Good evening. The show will begin shortly. Please take this opportunity to make sure your mobile devices are set to mute. Also, please note that there is no flash photography permitted during the show. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to AGO Creative Minds at Kerner Hall, presented in partnership with CBC Arts and Banff Center for Arts and Creativity. Please join us in welcoming the host of Cross Country Checkup on CBC Radio 1, Duncan McHugh.
Anin Bojo, Ankwadans Indigena Kas, Minwa Duncan McHugh, Jagnash Monuswan, Mainga Nedodem, Chippewaza Georgina Island, in Dunjaba Toronto, in Dinda, Bindigan Creative Minds. I'm very pleased to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. Prior to that, it was the Haudenosaunee and the Huron. And this is a territory that is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee, our brothers and sisters, the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, to share the resources and this land. And I saw an article in The Onion a little while ago about a guy on Tinder who started every Tinder date with a land acknowledgement. I think that's an appropriate way to go. Least you can do, yeah. Of course, it's a great evening to have this because COP24 is starting over in Poland right now. Let's get a show of hands. How many people are feeling hopeful about what's going to come out of COP24? Yeah, you're a glass half full kind of crowd, eh? Okay, so we're going to try to inform and enlighten and entertain this evening as we have this very important discussion about climate change. We're going to kick it off with some entertainment, and I want you to put your hands together and welcome a wonderful artist, Martha Wainwright.
Hi. I'm going to do a new song and an old song. And this newer song I haven't recorded it yet or anything, and I've been having a really tough time lately in my life. I thought I had suffered enough. But no, I hadn't. And I was going through a really bad divorce, which is like kind of like the worst thing ever. And I write all these songs that are quite autobiographical, which has gotten me into some trouble, to be perfectly honest with you. And but oddly enough, this song came out, and I thought it was quite hopeful. And so I thought it would be a nice way to start our evening, because it's about to go downhill. From out of that, it's going to be like, ah!
I cried only one tear for us today, and I will wipe it away before the day breaks. And there is love in every part of me, I know, but the key is falling deep into the snow. So when the spring comes, I will find it and lock my heart to unwind it, and love will be reborn. And love will be reborn. I take the throne and throw away the crown, and weave flowers in my hair from all around. And the injustices I've heard I will swallow, and reform the words to birds to undo the sorrow. And love will be reborn. And love will be reborn. Can you hear my heart? It's calling out your name. Can you hear my heart? It's dying in your flame. Oh, the city's gone, it's no longer there. The walls are falling down everywhere. And love will be reborn. And love will be reborn. And from the ruins there will come a new moon, a newborn sun, and we'll drink the dew from the flowers' hands, and ride on wing back to the new land. And love will be reborn. And love will be born. Thank you. Very much. I'll do a song, an older song from my first record. It's called Factory, and it was inspired by the factories that lined the coastline of Oxnard, California, just up from Los Angeles, and how depressing and awful it looked. And it's about a lot of things, but I'm never quite sure. I did do a fair bit of acid in my youth, and so sometimes the lyrics aren't as clear as they could be. But I find with that, it means that the songs can take on new meaning and new shapes as the years go by. These are not my people, I should never have come here. Chick with the dick and the gift for the gab. place, I've seen a face. I'll take the coast from factory to factory, on these nights that I've been all alone, and through my window the moonlight she shone, on my walls the fire she burned, playing out my very last chance to run, 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 run. Don't look back, you're moving fast. I know a place, I've seen a face, and I'll take the coast from factory to factory, oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And there are millions and millions of people around, on my TV, walking my streets, making sounds, and I can walk with them. I love them, I need them. There's others I have known as poor souls, sores exposed to the run of the mill, the destitute and the cold. Sores exposed to blisters and shines, well, and a kind of kindness is as far as the sun, the sun, the sun, the sun. Run, 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 run. I know a place, and I've seen a face, and I'll take the coast from factory to factory, oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. All right. Run, run, all right, all right, all right. Run, run, run. People, I should never have come here. She quit the deck and the gear for the gal. I know a place, and I've seen a face, and I'll take the coast from factory to factory, oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Thank you so much.
The Earth has a fever, and the fever is rising.
Our planet is reaching a tipping point.
I was just coming up the street to see my neighbors, and I didn't realize my house gone too.
As global temperatures rise,
we are part of a system that is killing a planet.
the effects of climate change are accelerating around us.
The fact that we are not doing what scientists are urging, surely that's a crime against future generations.
Get out! Get out!
From melting polar ice caps, to deadly storms, to catastrophic floods, to raging wildfires, the world is heating up at an unprecedented scale.
I'm surrounded by fire.
Threatening our very survival. We only have ourselves to blame. While deniers stall.
Speaking of global warming, we need some global warming.
Time is running out. In this man-made epoch, known as the Anthropocene, can we incite change through art? Can we bridge the gap between knowledge and action? Tonight, 3 of Canada's foremost cultural institutions present a conversation about our destructive footprint on the planet and pose the question, can art steer us toward a better future and help us survive? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is one of the world's leading environmental attorneys.
What President Trump is trying to do is to move forward by looking in the rearview mirror.
Named one of 100 Agents of Change by Rolling Stone magazine, he serves as president and senior counsel for Waterkeeper Alliance, a nonprofit that holds polluters accountable and supports grassroots efforts to protect waterways worldwide. The son of former Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and the nephew of former U.S. President John F. Kennedy,
This is the front line.
he is also an activist, a best-selling author, and a clean technology entrepreneur. Jennifer Baichwal is one of Canada's preeminent documentary filmmakers. A frequent collaborator with photographer Ed Bertinsky and cinematographer Nick Depensier. She has long been documenting the human impact on our globe. 2006's Manufactured Landscapes, which opened our eyes to the fallout of industrial waste, was named one of 150 essential works in Canadian cinema history by the Toronto International Film Festival.
It could be a full-scale catastrophic change.
Most recently, Anthropocene, the Human Epoch, her third collaboration with Bertinsky and Depensier, is a disturbing wake-up call about humanity's destructive re-engineering of our planet. Tanya Talaga is an award-winning Canadian journalist and author of the critically acclaimed 7 Fallen Feathers, Racism, Death, and Hard Truths in a Northern City, which won the 2018 RBC Taylor Prize for Nonfiction and the 2018 Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing. The book investigates the deaths of 7 First Nations youth in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Drawing from her Anishinaabe heritage and the family legacy of residential school survivors, Talaga's work explores the critical theme of Indigenous cultural survival.
Every child in this country be given the same basic human rights that will allow them to have a good start in life.
Recently, she made history as the first Indigenous woman to give the prestigious CBC Massey Lectures, which focused on the effects of cultural genocide on Indigenous children. Brian Youngin is one of the most highly regarded Canadian artists of his generation. Renowned for his dynamic sculptures made out of repurposed commercial goods, the North Okanagan, BC-based artist expresses a concern for the environment and Indigenous rights through his work. In his most famous series, The Prototypes for New Understanding, Youngin refashioned Nike Air Jordans in the likeness of Northwest Coast masks. Inspired by his Daneza heritage, his art explores a long history of cultural inequality and commitment to Indigenous traditions while slyly questioning the wastefulness of modern mass consumerism. The Art Gallery of Ontario, CBC Arts, and Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity, with the support of Jonas and Linda Prince, present Creative Minds.
And I do want to really extend a thank you to Jonas and Linda Prince, who are here in the audience this evening. Please put your hands together. They have the vision to put this series together. So, without further ado, let's get going with our conversation. I want to introduce our panel this evening. Robert Kennedy Jr., Jennifer Baichwal, Tanya Talaga, and Brian Youngin. I want to get personal right off the bat and start off with just why it is that you care about the environment. So if I could ask each one of you, was there a moment in your childhood that you really connected to nature that made you get connected to the environment in your adult years? And I'll start with you, Robert.
Can I say something off the bat? I just heard my voice, how it sounds on TV, which I can't stand. I want to apologize for the way it sounds. I had a very, very strong voice till I was 42 years old, and then I got struck with this illness called spasmodic dystonia. And some days I have a strong voice, some days it's weaker, and we'll see what happens tonight. But it's actually not painful for me, but it's painful for people who have to listen to me.
So far, it's great.
And I also want to thank you for having me up here. I love coming to Canada, and particularly to Toronto. I get to come here a lot because we have a waterkeeper here, the Lake Ontario waterkeeper, and now we have a doc, Gord Downey, who is one of our great supporters of the Waterkeeper Alliance up here in Canada. We have a pier out on Lake Ontario. So I want to thank Mark Madsen, who's the Lake Ontario waterkeeper who's here tonight. I grew up, I believe I was born with a preoccupation with nature and the outdoors. I started racing homing pigeons and breeding them when I was 7 years old. I started training hawks when I was 9, and I do that today and practice falconry. My father got us whitewater kayaking when we were very little, and then we were sailing from, when we could walk, and being in the water and just being exposed to the environment. I was also conscious of pollution because where we lived, where I was raised in Virginia, which was very, very rural, across the river from us were a number of cement plants, and they were billowing, stinking smoke all the time. And that prompted me when I was 8 years old to write a letter to my uncle, President Kennedy, and ask him for an audience to talk to him about environment and pollution. And he had me to the Oval Office. I brought him a salamander that I had caught the night before. It actually had died in the chlorinated water, but I was in denial about that. And we spent a lot of our conference talking about the health of the salamander, and he was poking it with a pen saying, "It doesn't look well to me. It's sleeping." But I told him at that point that I wanted to write a book about pollution and the environment, and he arranged for me to meet with his Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, and also with Rachel Carson, who had just put out her book, Silent Spring, and he was in the process of defending at that time. And that meeting in particular had a huge impact on me, and in the way that I ended up spending my career.
The salamander story sounds like a famous cricket story that we have here in Canada with Peter Zosky and Stuart McLean. Have any of you heard about the cricket that was alive or not alive? Jennifer Baichwal, can you tell me what about you growing up?
I grew up on Vancouver Island and on the West Coast, and I used to walk through with my family by myself old growth Douglas fir forests, and it was like being in a primordial place. And I always used to think at that moment, maybe I'm the first person who has ever walked in this place, maybe I'm the first person who's ever touched this tree. And that idea of pristine nature and my understanding of how that has changed over the years as I have learned more about the destruction, especially deforestation on Vancouver Island and on the West Coast and in this country, had a profound impact on me.
Brian Youngin, you're from BC as well. What about growing up? When did you connect with nature?
Yeah, I grew up in northern BC, and my family had a fairly large cattle ranch, and I had a horse before I had a bicycle, and that was a very natural progression for me to get involved with nature and exploring the territory and the land that my ancestors live on and continue to live on in northeastern BC.
And Tanya, you grew up here in the city of Toronto, so what about you?
I did, but my memory is of actually where my mother is from and all the mothers before her are from, and that's on the shores of Lake Superior, Gitchigami. I remember being about 7 or 8 years old, and I was with my Uncle Charlie, and we were outside of where she was raised, which is a little place called Wraith, Ontario, and you'll see the road sign if you're ever driving through from Thunder Bay to Manitoba. It's on the highway. And we were there, and I remember being surrounded by trees, and Uncle Charlie was with me, and he was looking for rabbits. We were snaring rabbits for dinner, and I was running. And I just remember running, and my feet were touching the ground, and there was mulch and cedar and rock, and the trees were just so tall around me. And it was like they were speaking to me, and I felt, this is where I am from, and this is where I belong. It was very clear.
Yeah, the reason I ask you about your youth is just that I think that it's so much, I mean, for me, spending my summers with my grandmother and my shomas at Georgina Island First Nation and being on the lake, I mean, were moments that have been imprinted into who I am as an adult today, and I think for so many people, the experiences that they have, the opportunities that they have to connect with nature as youth, end up, making a difference in whether or not they're concerned about climate change. We are here to talk about art and climate change, but I want to set the scene for where we're at in climate change right now. And Robert, if I could start with you. I mean, the IPCC report, this latest one that came out, I've followed a number of them. This one seemed to have the most blunt language yet. Can you set the scene for where we're at?
Well, the IPCC report was, I think they designed it finally to be sobering, not just the people who care about the environment, but they directly address the economic impact. And we were talking backstage that, we're on track for a 2-degree rise in temperature, and that is a cost of $69 trillion to our society. The United States, according to the report, will lose about 10% of its economy in the next decade. So it's something that, it's a security issue. We've known that for a long time. It's going to cause global disruption. The other way to answer your question, where are we now? We have the technology to solve our most critical environmental problems. The problem really is a political problem. It's inertia in our political system, and that's driven largely by the incumbent industries that have a stake in carbon and want to keep that stake. And in the United States particularly, there's no limit on how much those companies can put into the political process. So last presidential election, the Democratic Party put about approximately $1 billion into the presidential election. The Republican Party put about $1 billion in, and the Koch brothers put about $1 billion in. And one of the reasons for that is that they own $60 billion worth of carbon in the Alberta tar sands. And that's why one of the first things that President Trump did when he came into office and that the new Congress did was to approve the XL pipeline and these pipelines that are designed to carry that tar sands to market. Those industries dominate our political process. We can produce carbon now. We can produce. It costs about $1 billion to build a gigawatt of solar energy. It costs $1 billion to build a gigawatt of wind energy now, and it costs about $5 billion to build a gigawatt of coal energy. So there's no reason that anybody in the world, and it costs about $9 billion a gigawatt to build nuke. No reason in the world why anybody would ever build one of those unless they get huge subsidies from the government, and that's what that $60 billion is invested in. And that's the battle that we have to fight. It's a political battle. It's not a technological challenge.
Well, you say battle. You've actually used the term war in the past. Why do you describe it that way?
you can really, that's just not hyperbole. You can really speak about this in biblical terms. We're dealing with Armageddon. I mean, right now, today, I filed a lawsuit on behalf of a group of families who lost their homes and lives in the California fire. So, and my house was filled with refugees. My sister and her family were among them. And, we have environmental refugees in our country from Katrina, from all of these storms, from the fires in California. And we're fighting a battle for the survival of our values, of our society, this is a $69 trillion shift in costs from our generation to the next generation. This is immoral in every way. It's deficit spending. It's a way of loading the costs of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. And all of that, virtually all of that money is going to subsidies for large carbon incumbents, or oil, coal, gas industry. To support them, we're imposing $69 trillion of costs on the rest of us, and they view it as a war. We have to view it as a war if we're going to take back our country, and if we're going to preserve civilization for next generations of humanity.
Jennifer, your project, your latest one, is called Anthropocene. Can you explain what that word refers to? Bad.
That's really good. That's so much better than when we started this project 5 years ago. And part of the reason for starting the project was to try to bring that word into the vernacular, make people understand what it meant, why. So Anthropocene, or Anthropocene, you can say it however, is a period in the Earth's history that there are a group of scientists who have been gathering evidence for 10 years who say that we are now in a different geological epoch. We have left the Holocene epoch, which was the geological epoch since the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago, and that we are now in the Anthropocene because humans changed the Earth and its systems more than all natural processes combined. And their categories of research, which they are about to publish in a book, were our categories of research. They informed what we did for this project, which is a film and a book and an exhibition. And you may ask why. I mean, the language of war, the language of urgency, but there's something about thinking in geological time and on a planetary scale that is crucial to understanding the state that we're in right now, I think, for climate change.
Robert talked about environmental refugees. You traveled the world for your film. I mean, and incredible scenes in Chile and Russia and Germany, all over the place. Are there particular populations of the world that you think are most vulnerable right now?
Oh, the most vulnerable are, first of all, the World Bank has estimated that there will be 140 million refugees by 2050. 140 million climate refugees. So when we think about that, all of the places we go to, and we go to places where people are the most vulnerable. So the most vulnerable populations are obviously people who are living in areas that cannot adapt, that don't have the resources to adapt and are at low levels. But it's also other species. So we have the most vulnerable people, and we have all the species of the Earth that are not human as well, that we are taking down with us.
So there was a study that was released this week about the impacts on the insect population. It was so horrific,
devastating,
disturbing that we're going to lose. We've already lost a substantial part of the insect population. We're on track to lose 90% of it, including all of the pollinators.
Yeah.
Tanya, you've traveled a lot as well in your journalism career. You were up in Hudson Bay a couple of years ago. I'm wondering what kind of things you were hearing from folks in the north about climate change.
Thanks for asking about that. Actually, I was noticing on Twitter tonight that you have an episode on the polar bear as well.
Yeah, so on the National tonight.
Yeah, and I was actually going to talk a little bit about that because I went up the Weenusk River to Hudson Bay and then along the Hudson Bay coast to Cormorant Point, which is Polar Bear Provincial Park. And I remember we were there to see polar bears and to live at Cormorant Point for a bit with our Cree guides. And they were telling me, they were Cree elders, they were saying that the polar bears have changed their habitat. They're eating snow geese now. And they never used to do that before, but they're doing that because they're starving, because of the ice moving. And, you know, the polar bears that we saw too, they're not big and fat polar bears as you think in your mind as they would be. They were smaller. And I also remember very vividly when we traveled up the Weenusk River, seeing the erosion of the riverbanks, and it was just the wildest thing I'd ever seen before because it looks like someone's taken an ice cream scoop and just carved out the sides of these hills and valleys. And I remember saying to Sam Hunter, who is our guide from Peawanuck, and I said, you know, why is it like that? And he goes, that's the erosion from the permafrost. That's what you see right there. And to me, it was just, this is really happening now.
You mentioned the polar bear piece. So I was up in Churchill, and the story is on the National tonight. But I mean, how many of you have touched a polar bear before? I actually had that opportunity. We were following a scientist who's been, tracking polar bears for over 40 years, and it is shocking to see the lack of body weight on some of the polar bears. He said 30 years ago when we started this research, they weigh them between 1 and 5. They were all 4s and 5s. Now we've got 3s, 2s, and there was one polar bear that we actually literally touched, which is was barely a 1. And so it is really quite shocking, I'd say, to see the impact on the animal population. We're here to talk about art, though, and so Brian, I wonder if I could bring you in this conversation. Your work, I mean, is renowned around the world for repurposing consumer objects. Nike Air Jordans and patio furniture and leather couches. What kind of message were you trying to send by using those kind of household consumer products?
Well, I think like my Donizab family, I was picking up on a tradition of using the things in my immediate environment. And I was, back then, mainly living in Vancouver, but living in a very urban environment. And I wanted to use items that people would just see in their everyday life, because it's I felt a good way of people to start to change the way they look at the things in their life and the things that they produce or choose to buy or that they throw out. So that was, to me, a very good entry point to start talking about something like the environment. I also just chose things because they have specific cultural meaning, like Air Jordan sneakers, for instance. So those were something that were very important to me as they still hold a huge cultural significance.
The piece that really struck me when I first saw your work was the gigantic whale, and many people here will have seen that sculpture that you made out of patio furniture. And when you presented that piece to the world, there were people who were asking about, whether or not you were making commentary about recycling. How much of that was part of your artistic process and thinking?
Well, I didn't sit there and think, I'm going to make a piece about recycling. So that, things just kind of. Am I cutting out?
A little bit, yeah. Your mic's cutting out. So maybe if we could get the mic fixed, and I'll come back to you about that. But Jennifer, since we're talking about art, I mean, it seems like a really important question to me when we're talking about climate change. How much of it is about art? How much of it is about activism when it comes to making movies about climate change?
Well, I mean, Shapeshifter is a perfect example of something that, a work that has meaning on so many different levels at the same time. And it's actually, it's such a fascinating incredible piece. But art as an arena of inquiry about these things that are, that are facing us, these problems, has, I think, a unique quality in that it's a very rich arena, because it's not just something that we argue about, it's not just intellectual, it's emotional, it's visceral, it hits you all at the same time. And the other thing about it is that it can't be translated, it can't be paraphrased, it has to be experienced. And I think that somehow, in that place of experiencing, you can open up consciousness in a different way. So the relationship is about allowing you, or actually kind of forcing you, as a participant, as a viewer, to sit with this problem for a while, instead of sort of, make a decision about it and then go away. To actually live with that problem, and give you the capacity for, or force you into, demand sustained reflection on this problem, because it's a complex problem.
As I was watching Anthropocene, a scene that struck me was this gigantic bulldozer in Germany, like just
bucket wheel excavator.
Bucket wheel excavator. Yeah. There you go. I didn't even know there was such a thing as bucket wheel excavators until I saw your film. And watching it, digging away relentlessly at the earth in Germany, yet it was so beautiful the way that you and your team presented it. And so, what was your thinking, and as you were trying, of the aesthetics of the piece as you were putting it together?
Well, I'm sure many people here know Ed Vertinsky's photographs, and one of the reasons that I was drawn to his work and why I made Manufactured Landscapes is that his work was, in some ways, the ambiguity is the heart of its power. And there is, I wouldn't call it beautiful, but I would say that when you are compelled aesthetically to experience something, when something draws you in, you grapple with it longer, and it invites you into a conversation about what that thing means. If it's ugly, if it's horrifying, you can just turn away immediately in disgust. But somehow the need to have something that aesthetically kind of pulls you in is what starts the conversation about what that piece means. The very first piece I saw of Ed's was densified oil filters. I thought it was an abstract painting across the room. And I thought, wow, that's beautiful. And I went over and looked at it, realized I was looking at garbage, recoiled in revulsion, then realized that the garbage I was looking at was my own garbage. And it was this incredible process that came from my desire to engage with that work.
You've also faced criticism, though, because for aestheticizing tragedy, if you will. How do you respond to that?
Well, we get that. We get the aestheticization of what is ugly, and also the fact that we're sort of fiddling while Rome is burning by not hitting these issues harder. And it's a good argument. I have a lot of friends who do work that is way more polemic, right? They engage in polemic. And yet, there is something about the non-didactic experiential understanding that can come from an aesthetically compelling experience, and also adding in that time that you need to spend with art, because it is not paraphrasable. If it's paraphrasable immediately, it's propaganda. So those two things together somehow allow, I think, for a more complex shift in consciousness.
As a journalist, Tanya, how do you approach trying to get your audience, your storyteller too, a journalist and a storyteller, how do you approach trying to get your audience to care about something abstract like climate change?
I think that story is the main way to get people to care. I think in the same way that you use your art to get people to care, I hope to use story and to relay what people are experiencing, what people are feeling, to tell the world, this is what we feel, this is how we see things. I often tell story. I just got finished doing the Massey lectures, and in those lectures I talked about the Anishinaabe worldview of things, of how we are people, but we are spirits walking this earth, and we are very much connected to this earth. And I think that everyone can understand those feelings if you're Indigenous or if you're not Indigenous, but it's a different way of seeing the world when you're telling a story from an Indigenous perspective. It is an important perspective to talk about because the Indigenous perspective is being very much tied to the land that we're from. Separate the land, destroy the spirit. That's very much how we feel. And so it's telling story, one person's story, one community's story, one community's struggle. I think that's how you reach people and show them this is actually what's happening now.
And Brian, you got your mic back now, so let me ask you again about your work. You got two mics. There's a Gary, is that one working? One of them's got to be working.
That's working.
Good? There we go. Remember that cartoon, The Far Side, Gary Larson? I remember this one cartoon. There was some Indians sitting in front of a teepee, and little tiny children Indians were sitting around, and this old grizzled elder Indian was hanging, and he was holding this one piece of thing up in the air, and there was stuff hanging all over it, and he was holding up, and he was saying, you know, this is the one part of the buffalo that we don't eat. I wonder, as far as your work goes, how much of it was influenced by your Indigenous heritage in terms of the way we approach the land?
I think my early work came out of an appreciation of how my Indigenous family is resourceful and how they use a lot of, not only the traditional ways of hunting and using a lot of animal, but also in repurposing items just out of economic need. So I started at a young age, I think, really observing that. And then just to go back to the whale skeleton, I started to see that those chairs, once they broke, they couldn't be fixed. So people would just chuck them out. And so I started collecting them because I thought, there must be something that can be done with these things. And to me, they kind of felt liberated once they weren't chairs anymore. So I had to point them in a new direction rather than to the landfill. So I tried a bunch of stuff, and then some things didn't work out. And a couple things I tried here in Toronto and didn't work out, but we won't talk about those. until I kind of started reading about the 19th century energy transfer from whale oil to petroleum. Wow. And so when I started reading that and noticing that the disappearance of the whaling industry was around the birth of the petroleum industry, that led me to think that these chairs could be starting to talk about a form like the whale or something like that.
Robert, what about you? I mean, so much of your work has been involved in the legal arena, in looking at regulations. But I wonder, what do you think artists can bring to this discussion about climate change?
We couldn't function without artists, without the contributions that artists have made in so many ways to what we're doing. And if you, I mean, just as an example, I think it's hard to imagine that we would have won the battle as we have against the nuclear industry in the United States without the film China Syndrome. I don't think we would have gotten the tobacco settlement if somebody hadn't made Thank You for Smoking and The Insider. And as you were saying, there's so many, there's only so many people who will listen to the didactic argument. But people want to be entertained, and they are willing to be taught while they're entertained as long as you entertain them first. So that's part of it. But also, the musicians who've supported us directly in Waterkeeper, like Gord Downing, a lot of Canadian actors, Dan Aykroyd, Jim Carrey, Lorne Michaels, and many, many other, Neil Young. I tried a case this summer against Monsanto, which is the first of about 10,000 cases that we're about to file, that we filed against Monsanto on Roundup. And we had a 2-month jury trial in San Francisco, and we won a very historic and and a milestone $289 million jury judgment on behalf of one man who got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma from spraying Roundup and being exposed to it. One of the reasons I think we did so well was Neil Young came and sat in the courtroom, and the jury, saw him there. And Neil Young has written, done an album against Monsanto. He's educated people about them, and I think, all of these things, the role that artists play in a society is to see commonality. Commonality oftentimes can't be expressed in language or words or politics, but it gets us all to transcend our narrow self-interest and see ourselves as part of something larger than ourselves, and to recognize our humanity. Neil Young wrote songs for many, many years, not specifically about the environment, but just about the human condition. And if you listen to them today, you almost think they're about the environment because they express a value that make you have empathy for other human beings and for suffering and for the way that they live and the way that the struggles of conducting our lives and the beauty and the miracle of humanity. And artists can tell us those messages in a way that economists and attorneys cannot. And
I think "Long May You Run" may be about a car, but it could be an allegory for what we're talking about this evening. Jennifer, I wonder. I did a documentary on a Native American photographer, Camille Seaman from the States, who did the most beautiful photos of icebergs in the north and tornadoes and storms throughout the Midwest. And she said it was really interesting working with the scientists, because she said the scientists are like Paul Revere. They're running through the, they're running through the streets and they're saying, the world is changing, and no one's listening. So that she felt that was part of her role to share that message with her audience. I wonder, what's it like for you working with scientists as an artist?
Well, as Bobby said, there's the commonality that we all need to recognize that there's a cross-pollination that can happen between disciplines and interdisciplinarity. And in our world today, which is so polarized politically, these interdisciplinary points of contact create greater understanding. And so it's interesting, someone was talking about art, that awe and disgust are two emotions that cross partisan lines. Everybody feels them. And we can feel that, So, but I sort of feel like the scientists pass the baton to us, and then we pass the baton to the activists, and the activists pass the baton to ordinary people who are grappling to understand. And they don't have the same kind of communications, because they write papers and they're incredibly dense, and I've gone through a number of them in the past 5 years trying to understand them. But some of the terms, like the whale sculpture is made of technofossils. Technofossils are human-created materials that persist in the biosphere and eventually end up in the rock layers of the Earth. So when you look at, landfill sites, these huge walls of plastic bags, that will eventually become compressed and lithified. So our rocks of the future will be human-made. Things like terraforming of the Earth. These are their categories. Terraforming of the Earth for agriculture, for industrialization, for urbanization. Things like anthroturbation, human tunneling under the Earth. These are the kind of things that they explore. Our job, I felt, was to open up understanding about them and bring them to life in some way so that people can understand, we really are affecting every single system on Earth more than all natural processes. And these are some of the ways that we're doing it.
You just mentioned a really important word, though, about how it's important to connect with your audiences emotionally. And I wonder, Brian, when you're putting your work together, how much is that on your mind that you want to try to connect with people who view your art through their emotions?
Well, I kind of think that if folks who look at my work mainly exists in museums. So it already has a kind of specified audience. It's not like people are seeing it just in an everyday, driving to work kind of thing. But I try to share some of the excitement and exhilaration that I get making it. And so that, to me, is a really good way to get people interested in the work. I want them to be able to see that there's something that they see every day in their life, but it's changed, and it's changed to something that, that they have to figure that out. But in terms of how they might feel about it, that's kind of up to them. I don't really want to try to, say how they might react to something I make. So.
Tanya, you had some kids from the north down here in the city just the past couple of weeks, brought them down to the CBC. They're from the Dennis Franklin Cromartie School.
That's right.
On the one hand, they've got a very, their concerns are very much in front of them in terms of just needing to have a proper working school with a proper working gym.
That's right.
But then you also took them to Jennifer's exhibit at the AGO. I wonder what kind of reaction these Anishinaabe kids had to Jennifer's work.
It was really cool. We had, oh my goodness, I think we was about 12 students from Dennis Franklin Cromartie, which is a First Nations high school in Thunder Bay. And they came down here. We went to go visit you, and then we went to the gallery, and it just totally worked out. We got tickets to see your show and your exhibit, and all the kids are honor roll students, and many of them, most of them were artists as well. Wow. And so we walked through the show together, and it was eye-opening for the kids, and the students, I kept calling them kids. I've got kids around the same age, and it's just terrible, but we were really amazed by just the scope and the scale, The kids all come from remote communities, from communities high up in the boreal forest, from communities that are impacted so much by climate change. A lot of communities that they live in, for example, don't have access to fresh water. And it's actually curious that their high school in Thunder Bay, they actually can't drink the water because of the lead in the water. Right. And so there we were at the art gallery seeing all of your exhibits, and it was amazing because the kids were just struck by it, and we sat for quite a long period of time just watching the burning tusks. Yeah. That was one of the things that everyone felt so connected with, and I couldn't get them to leave that part of the exhibit. It was just so visceral and there. And all of the cars, too, all the pileups of the cars, that also struck them. It's just the waste was striking for all of us.
It's interesting because 10,000 students will have gone through the show by the time it ends, which is pretty extraordinary, like that number of kids. But also that the idea of the tusk pile and it's a very apocalyptic moment. It feels incredibly apocalyptic. And we're talking about the deaths of, 7,000 to 10,000 elephants that are represented in these piles. And it was the biggest burn that took place in history in 2016. And the message was, there is no market for ivory, period. Ivory is not a commodity. Ivory belongs to elephants. None of this ivory can ever be sold, can ever be turned into,
They were really upset by that, though, by the burning. And they're like, why are they doing that?
Interesting.
Why? Yeah, it was like, how can that happen? Why are you doing that?
A lot of teenagers are upset by my cutting up Air Jordans, too.
Well,
That's true. Which is what great art is all about, right? Is getting us emotional. And so I wonder, there is, in the past 10 to 15 years, we've seen more and more climate change or climate-related art. And I think, I'm thinking of Margaret Atwood's, trilogy as being very impactful on me, something that I read and I just went, whoa, it was kind of cli-fi, if you will. I'm wondering if I could ask each one of you kind of rapid fire, what was one piece of climate art that's had an impact on you? And I'll throw that out to anybody that wants to start.
Since I was just talking about it, I'm just going to talk about the tusks, because that struck me too. It was just unbelievable to see, and just the burning, and it just didn't stop. And it was on loop at the gallery, and it was just, it just hit you.
So the thing about that, it seems apocalyptic, but it's actually an act of hope. And I think that is the thing that is again, that idea that ambiguity is the heart of the power of the work in some way. You're looking at it, it looks terrible, it is terrible, but that was an incredibly brave thing for that government to do. It was worth over $100 million. I mean, we're talking about a huge amount of whatever that they could have used some way else, or rationalized selling or giving up, and they didn't do it. So I take that as being an incredible act of hope.
Is there a piece of work that's influenced you in terms of heightening environmental concerns?
Oh, like every day, there's work that moves me, and certainly when I brought up the work of Ed's, I mean, we started in that place together 13 years ago because of the fact that work did not preach, that work did not preach but invited you in, and it's an interesting thing because we are talking about business as usual in the world. Like when you say the scale is overwhelming, when you see everything that we're doing, but these are things that are happening every single day. It's what we need to do the things that we do as civilizations. It's what we need to live every day. Maybe need is the wrong word. What we use to live every day is the scale of these places. It's not unusual. It is actually usual. It is ordinary.
And I see the wheels spinning and trying to think about some art that's made an impact on.
When I was a kid, I was very influenced by the Hudson River School painters, like Thomas Cole, Frederick Church, Samuel F.B. Morris, Bierstadt, and Cropsey, and they played this key role in our nation's history when our country, after the American Revolution, was kind of, people were looking around and say, who are we? Because we're not European anymore. But what does it mean to be American? And, at first they were experimenting. They said, we're kind of like the new Greeks. So they named places Annapolis, and they, made all the buildings with Doric and Ionian columns. And this Hudson River School came in and said, this country is about wilderness and about nature. And you don't have to be ashamed because you don't have the 1,500 years of culture that they have in Europe, because you have this relationship to the land, and particularly with wilderness, which is the undiluted work of the Creator, and that's going to be the source of your values and virtues and your character as a people. If anybody's seen, this is what I was really thinking of when you asked that question, if anybody's seen the movie After the Flood, which was made by Leonardo DiCaprio, which is a really great documentary on global warming. It begins with a painting by Hieronymus Bosch, the Renaissance painter, that his parents, Leonardo's parents, were hippies, and they put that painting over his crib, and it has 3 panels. And one of the panels is like the Garden of Eden with all the happy animals and people with each other. And the second panel is the 7 deadly sins kind of infusing and corrupting that picture. And the third panel is a picture of kind of nightmarish devastation, and it's a depiction kind of hell. And he grew up for the first 5 years of his life in that bed looking at that.
This just explains so much more about Leo DiCaprio now. Hieronymus Bosch, going to sleep like that. I wanted to talk about what we do, what needs to be done, and again, where art fits into this. Tanya, one of the stories that struck me in your Massey lectures was the story about Big Brother's hunger, which was a Cree legend. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
This story was told to me by Edmund Atwabin, who is from Fort Albany First Nation, and we were together on a raft. This was this boat that Ed had made with his own hands by tying cedar logs together, and we were on this raft going down the Albany River. And if you know where the Albany River is, or if you don't know where it is, I'll tell you. It's in northern Ontario, and it cuts through from James Bay westward, 982 kilometers long, and it's a big winding river. And we were on this river, and we had with us some kids, some youth from Fort Albany First Nation who had never been out on the land before. Even though they lived in a fly-in community along the James Bay coast, they'd never been out experiencing their culture and living on the land. So we were on this raft, and I remember so clearly this rain. So we were standing outside. Everybody else was in this little sort of cabin that Ed had built, and they were all warm, and they were drinking tea. And Ed and I were standing outside, and the rain was just hitting us. And that's when he told me the story about Big Brother and Big Brother's insatiable hunger. And the story is how Big Brother, he wants and he wants and he wants, and he won't stop his hunger. And he eats everything that he sees. He wants all of the trees. He wants all the precious metals that are in the ground. He wants the diamonds and the gold and the silver. Big Brother wants all the clean water. And Big Brother enlists Little Brother to get all of these things for him. So Little Brother is constantly the slave for Big Brother, going out there, getting the rocks, getting the gems, getting the water from the earth, and feeding the insatiable appetite of Big Brother, and Big Brother just won't stop. And Ed turned to me and he said, I wonder when it's going to be that Little Brother is going to stand up and say, enough. I'm not going to feed you anymore. You're on your own now. And that legend speaks to so many things. It speaks to many things about climate change. It speaks to many things about us too as people, us as Indigenous people, and where our place is on the land. And when we stand up and say, no, we're not going to feed you anymore, you can't take that anymore. Because every time you do that, every time you take, you destroy our spirits too. Because this is our connection, this is our land.
The legend, I mean, there are many interpretations of it, but it also obviously could be interpreted to be about consumerism. And yesterday on Cross Country Checkup, we asked people right across the country about whether or not they were inspired to live a minimalist lifestyle, given that we're in the peak shopping season right now and people are just buying. I wonder, Brian, for you, in terms of your work and the way that you've used consumer goods, how much of it is a critique or a commentary on consumerism and the damage it's doing to our planet?
Yeah, I think that's definitely there, that exists. I mean, I grew up like everyone else, wanting the things that I saw on television and whatnot, so I think it's a bit difficult because I actually make objects, and those objects are commodities. They're artworks that are for sale. So it's a bit tricky to kind of steer around that a bit. I mean, I'm tangled up in the art world. It's how I make my living, but I kind of, it's another beast that needs feeding. And it's something that it's a little bit like, I call it the tar sands of culture. The contemporary art market is something that nobody really wants to talk about. But it exists, and it's like, I don't buy art, but I make art commodities. And hopefully most of those land in museums where they become property of the public, and they don't get locked up in private collections. So.
Robert, in this country, we're very much talking about a price on carbon pollution right now when it comes to trying to figure out some solutions. What's your take on that?
Well, I think I feel strongly about a carbon tax, and I think we have to use markets. That's the only way. That's the only thing that's going to save us. I was on a board of directors with the CEO of Procter & Gamble, and he showed me at one point, after we got to know each other, he showed me, and by the way, I've sued Procter & Gamble a lot of times, but he showed me this marketing data, which made a big impression on me, because it was 100 years of marketing data, or 80 years of marketing data, and it showed that no matter that throughout every generation, the Great Depression, to the most prosperous times in our history, you never get more than 8% of people who will pay more for a product for a moral reason. That is the top end of that. So the only way that you're going to change human behavior, not by educating people, but by designing market rules so that they reward good behavior and punish bad behavior. And good behavior means efficiency, bad behavior is inefficiency and waste. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich, without enriching your community. A market would cause us to promote efficiency, and efficiency means the elimination of waste, and pollution is waste. In a true free market would require us to properly value our natural resources, and it's the undervaluation of those resources that cause us to use them wastefully. And that's why if you see a polluter, what we have now is not free market capitalism, it's corporate crony capitalism. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. That's what all pollution is. In a true free market, if you're an actor that wants to bring a product to the marketplace, you have to pay all the costs of getting it there, and that includes the cost of cleaning up after yourself, which was a lesson that we were all supposed to have learned in kindergarten. What they do, what polluters do, is they externalize those costs, and in doing that, they cheat the free market, and they send corrupt signals to the marketplace that rewards bad behavior. And for me, ultimately, the way that you change human behavior is by rewarding good behavior and punishing bad behavior in the marketplace, and that's what we ought to be doing.
So we're going into an election year in Canada, and it remains to be seen whether a carbon tax is going to be actually an election issue or not. But I wonder, Jennifer, you had a chance to have our Prime Minister view your exhibit at the AGO. What kind of conversation did you have with him?
Actually, it was at the National Gallery in Ottawa that he came through. And I will say, one of the things that we talked about was, just given the riots in Paris right now, about the fuel hike. So there is this belief that, an erroneous belief that environmental justice and social justice are in competition with each other. That if you're striving for environmental justice, then people will get hurt some way, that there'll be some kind of downturn economically. And it is so false, it is so wrong. And it is possible to have economic prosperity and sustainability at the same time. When you're talking about those numbers, 54 trillion, 69 trillion by 2100, given a 1.5 or a 2 degree increase, all of those costs are externalized. We're not even thinking about, we're not adding those in to the equation that we are making for economic prosperity. And if we turn to more sustainable forms, we would be able to do this. And so all of these cynical short-term thinkers that try to let us think that social and environmental justice are not the same thing and that they can't exist in harmony together, number one, that's wrong. And that was something that we talked about. And also the fact that we have the capacity to be prosperous and to be sustainable at the same time.
I just echo that. You hear the mantra of the big polluters and their indentured servants in Washington and Ottawa, and their toadies on Fox News, always saying the same thing, that we have to choose between environmental protection on the other and economic prosperity, and that's a false choice, as you say. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the Koch brothers and Donald Trump want us to do, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy, and we can make a few people billionaires by impoverishing the rest of us. But our children are going to pay for our joyride, and they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes, poor health, and huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time. And as you show, they will never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the cost of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children.
Let me ask you a question, though, about politics in your country. Because Tanya mentioned the story that I have on the National about polar bears tonight, and I tweeted it out, and then let me read you a tweet back that I got from a viewer. I honestly don't know who's telling truth anymore. Global warming, ? Climate change, ? It's all been politicized by hypocritical politicians and celebrities. These people aren't changing, why should we? There's a tweet that I got in response to the piece that's on tonight. And so I wonder, the last panel here at AGO was on art and truth. And when you're in a country where the president is calling climate change a hoax, how do you persuade people to change? How do you tell people this is the truth, folks?
Well, I think Mother Nature's telling them. I mean, I live in a state that's burning, literally. Entire towns and communities are being wiped out, and people know. In California, nobody is saying climate change is a hoax, and in New Orleans, they're not saying that, and in all the places that are getting hit by this weather, and more people are getting caught up in what you show, is the Anthropocene, which is, an era where ultimately the real question is, when will we have political impact? When will we be able to change behavior of our political system? And I would argue that's never going to happen as long as we have money controlling the politics, because money gives that side, the carbon cronies, such extraordinary resiliency. They have their own network, which is Fox News, that's telling people constantly this is a hoax, and then they have, all of their politicians, they control Congress. And as long as that's happening, the Koch brothers are going to control Congress, and we're not going to get real change.
That's Big Brother's hunger.
Yeah.
It won't stop. When's little brother going to stand up?
Well, and that is a very old story, which obviously has applications in 2018. And so I wonder, Tanya, if I could ask you, how much, it's important to me as an Anishinaabe journalist that those stories of our elders and the approaches that they taught us toward how we relate to the earth are shared in 2018 and seen as viable climate change solutions. How much do you hear from the Indigenous people that you've visited in the past year about wanting to be part of the climate change solution, those traditional knowledge economies?
I think there has to be, just listening to everyone talking here, I think there has to be a convergence. There has to be a convergence between environmental leadership and the fight with Indigenous leadership. Indigenous people are the stewards of the land. They know how to burn a forest and how to stop the burn of a forest. They know how things grow. That's what you grow up with. It's what you learn. These important lessons can be shown to be sustainable, but if you teach them the right way to people. And I think that what we're going to be seeing in the future is going to be a convergence between this movement and this movement, the Indigenous rights movement, because it's all the same. We're all searching for the same things here in a way, right? Sustainability, rights to water, rights to having enough, not a lot. This is one of the things too that I spoke to my elder Sam Ashni-Peneskan about, and that was how much we take from the land and how we've totally shifted what we used to do. Before, people would take First Nations people would take what they needed to live. And then there was a shift. There was a shift when the fur traders came, when capitalism came, everything changed, and we started taking more and more and more. And that altered the earth, that altered our forests, it altered our animals, it altered everything, really. I mean, these are the things, these lessons, though, that we have to think about and realize maybe we don't need all these things. Maybe we don't need all these plastic water bottles. Maybe we don't need all of these chairs that I'm sorry that you're using for your whales. But, are they really, we don't need those, really. But how do we stand up to Big Brother, the Koch brothers, and say, no, I'm sorry, you can't have that anymore. That's not enough. And you're right, you have to hit people with their pocketbooks. I think that's the only way you're going to do it, to get people to really change.
Brian, are there words that you draw on from elders back home or respected folks back home that in terms of approaches to climate change?
Well, I think is what Tanya was saying is that there's a traditional knowledge and intimate spatial history and knowledge of specific lands that are, patterned all across the country in First Nations and Indian country, and it's more has to be paid attention to that because these are folks who are out living on the front lines. They're the ones living in the forests in the far north and in remote parts of the country, and they have intimate knowledge of those places, and they understand how things like controlled burns work and how to eliminate fuels from the forest. And like forestry companies haven't listened to them, and now we're in a situation in BC where for generations cut blocks have been replanted with single species, and there's been no wildfire management or very little. And just like in California, we're having drought situations where the fires are just getting worse and worse. And unfortunately, I think a crisis like that is the only other way people will start changing their minds about climate change.
I recently did an article about ecological grief, which was a term that I had not heard before until it was explained to me, and it was talking about the mental health impacts that for many of us who are experiencing climate change, whether it's change in the landscape or whether it's a gigantic wildfire in California. But I wonder, as you guys weren't out here when I came out, but I asked people about whether they were feeling hopeful about COP24, and almost nobody put up their hand, except that nice lady up in the corner there who's obviously an optimist. But nobody put up their hand about what politicians are doing right now about climate change. So I wonder, everybody wants to know what can we do, right? What can we do? And you've said in the past, Robert, that it is more helpful to change a politician than change a light bulb.
Yeah.
Why? Why do you say that?
Well, that's where societal change comes from. We really, like I said, we need to rewrite the rules of the marketplace, which is done all the time. And, the free market capitalism is an engine. It's the most powerful engine ever invented. But it has to be harnessed to a social purpose. Otherwise, it's just going to create an oligarchy and ultimately a plutocracy. It's going to create it's going to serve the interests of the very rich and the very powerful. And you want markets. The market is like a hammer. It's not good, it's not evil. It depends what you build with it. And what we want to build, we need to know. We know what we want to build. We want to build a nation that gives the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health to our children as our parents gave us. And if we're not capable of doing that, we've failed them morally, and we've failed them economically in many, many other ways. We can do that, but we need to just develop market rules that punish bad behavior, which is inefficiency and waste, and reward good behavior, which is efficiency and sustainability. And you can do that. It's a simple thing to do. But in order to do that, and we have once we do that, we have the technology to clean up the mess. And it's exciting, and it's going to create jobs, and it's going to create prosperity. But the problem is really a political one. And as long as all of this money is flowing into our political system in the United States, it's very difficult to make headway and to do the things that we could do in an instant if we actually, if we had a government that was serving the interests of the American people, and if we had a market that was serving the interests of society.
But so that could be taken to be very, very discouraging, though, and disempowering. And I wonder, for the average citizen.
I'll say this: part of your question was about individual action versus kind of political action. And when I was a little boy, there was an ad that some of you, if you were in the United States, I don't know if they played it here, but millions, it was the most successful PSA in the history of our country, public service advertisement. And it was a picture of somebody throwing garbage on the highway, and it was an Indian who was crying.
I know.
It was a very, very famous ad. And it was created by a group that was called Keep America Beautiful, and it was very popular. So all of the networks gave time to this ad, and they gave almost $500 million in free time to this ad. Most people believe that Keep America Beautiful was a group that was against litter. It wasn't. It was a coalition of glass bottle and aluminum can manufacturers who wanted to tell the American public, who wanted to derail bottle bills that were then being proposed in all the states. And they were doing that by saying to Americans, it's your fault because you're greedy consumers and you're throwing this garbage on the highway, so why don't you clean up after yourself? But in Europe, they don't have landfills because the producers of garbage are required to pay for its disposal. In our country, the consumer and taxpayer pays for its disposal. And so if you use markets and say, if you put garbage into the stream, if you put material or packaging into the stream of commerce, you have to pay for its disposal or recovery. So in Europe, you don't get a credit card from Amazon that's this big in a box filled with styrofoam peanuts. That's this big. It comes in an envelope. Right? And you can't buy, when you were buying CDs in our country, they'd sell them in a plastic package that was this long so they could put advertising on it. But in Europe, it came in a cellophane wrapper. So it changes people's behavior if you charge them for doing bad things. And it's really simple, and it's really quick, and I'm optimistic, because we have the technology to solve all of these problems. It's really all about political inertia.
That was such a powerful ad, but curiously enough, the Indian in it was actually Italian. So you and I can have a good conversation about representation of Indigenous people in the media afterwards. Jennifer, I noticed at the Anthropocene, there was an exit survey about, and I'm just looking at it, about how it made you feel. And 28% of people responded, said they felt worried. 11% said they felt motivated. So how do you change that fear?
Every time I go in there, I press the motivated button.
Yeah, motivated.
Means people say that I'm skewing the results of that, but I'm not skewing the results because I go through the exhibit too quite often, and I'm motivated. But no, there's worried, sad, angry, motivated, suspicious, which is weird. Thank God that's the lowest one. And then there was indifferent was one, which was quite high. I'm not going to tell you how high it was. Not that high. But I mean, I have to say that it's been a 5-year journey, and we've been everywhere, and we go to some pretty hairy places, like the biggest open pit mine in Germany, and the biggest colored metal mine in the world in Norilsk in Siberia in Russia. And everywhere we went, to me, there were signs of hope, signs of people who were adapting, who had the forbearance, who had dignity and forbearance in living in these situations, working in these situations, the Dandora landfill, the people who lived and worked in that place every single day to make, paltry amounts of money by recycling. The people in the London Zoo who are tending all of the species that are extinct in the wild or at risk, that are spending their lives bringing these, the mountain chicken frog babies for 2 years so that they can be reintroduced into the wild. It's impossible to not experience and be with these people and these species that have forbearance, that are trying to survive with dignity without being changed in hope. And I would argue, yes, it is a political problem, but it's also about our consciousness. It's about how we live here. It's about never using single-use plastic again. It's never getting a bottle of Nestle water ever again, like never doing that. It's about those kind of things. We can do that too. And it's about uniting individual with collective action and not letting polarization divide us. Climate change is not a political issue. In the sense that it is real, right? It is not something that you don't believe if you're Republican and you believe if you're a Democrat or whatever the case is here, and I'm not going to talk about Ontario politics, but it's real. So we cannot allow those divisions, and I think collectively in coming together, we can find the solution with the political solution.
Brian, looking to the future, optimistic or pessimistic?
I'd say I'm fairly optimistic. Like you say, I try not to buy plastic bottles. I try to make informed decisions and encourage that where I live. I also am involved in agriculture. I have a ranch, and I'm trying to do things without chemicals. It's very laborious to not use chemicals, but it's something that I strongly believe in, and I am proud to be part of a food security network.
And Tanya, you managed to somehow make a discussion about Indigenous kids committing suicide into a hopeful one. What about when it comes to climate change? What gives you hope?
I hope that people are going to realize where they belong on this planet, where they belong. I think the Massey Lectures are very much a story about belonging and understanding who we are as people, understanding and having pride in who you are and who your ancestors were. And the Anishinaabe viewpoint of life is that everybody belongs. Everybody has a place and a purpose in this world. You don't exist to be individual. You don't exist to get out there and to be greedy and get everything you can and make all the money you can. That's not the way it's supposed to be. You're supposed to work together. You're part of a continuum of life. And that continuum is not decided by you, it's decided by the Creator, right? And also, too, you work not just for yourselves, but you work for 7 generations. We often talk about 7 generations. The work we're doing now is not just for us, it's for our children's children's children. And that gives me hope. It gives me hope every time that I'm with youth from the North and who have so much still to contend with in this world, from all the things that they live with, from racism, from the lack of access to clean water or to education, the lack of basic rights that everybody else in this country actually enjoys, but Indigenous kids don't. But they're still pushing, and they're still going, and they're still carving out a better place in this world, and that's what gives me hope, and I think it's the youth that will bring us forward. I hope so.
Thank you so much to all of you for a really informative and enlightening conversation, and it's been a real pleasure. And if everyone could give a round of a hand to Robert Kennedy, Jennifer Baichwal, Brian Youngin, and Tanya Talaga. I believe that there are some refreshments upstairs afterwards, so I hope you can stick around for that. Miigwech Bazinda Ayeg, thank you so much for listening to us, and please get home safely tonight.